2 years after a pair of hurricanes devastated Puerto Rico, what happened to 91 billion U.S. tax dollars intended for disaster aid?
Certainly contractors are making money, but individuals are not getting relief.
Our full measure investigation follows the money to see how much they've really gotten and why so many Puerto Rican and federal officials may be headed to prison.
The FBI has arrested some top officials here. How do you feel about being in the United States?
This woman from Central America tells me she jumped the border fence into the U.S. this morning, along with her disabled son.
We've helped in this facility about 12,500 people. The alternative, if we weren't existing, is these families would be dropped off at the bus stations.
Inside an Arizona volunteer shelter, helping thousands of families who've crossed into the U.S. illegally. And if you think state laws are written by your elected lawmakers, think again.
A frightening number of bills in state legislatures are being written by special interests of one kind or another.
This week, who's really holding the pen?
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Imagine having the task of distributing the most aid money ever for a natural disaster responsibly to a government mired in corruption and under FBI investigation. That's what's happening right now in the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, 2 years after two hurricanes, Maria and Irma. You have 91 billion reasons to care. That's how much of your tax money is intended for recovery. Today we go to Puerto Rico to follow the hurricane money and the fraud.
In the small Puerto Rican village of Corozal,
Hola, ¿cómo está?
Brenda Rodriguez is still waiting for help. She recorded the frightening rise of the river outside her doorstep during Hurricane Maria.
What were you thinking when you saw the river coming up like that?
That I was going to die and the house would fall apart.
Wow.
2 years later, Rodriguez still lives in the rotted-out home without a penny of the billions earmarked for hurricane recovery. She was surprised to learn she wasn't eligible for assistance because she doesn't own the house.
A young man came around and gave me an application to fill, and that's it.
The mainland United States government gave a lot of money to the territory of Puerto Rico for hurricane recovery.
Rodriguez's sister is on the phone helping translate.
Has she seen any of that money being spent in her community?
I haven't seen any of that.
62,000 Puerto Rican hurricane victims like Rodriguez have been denied emergency help for technical reasons. That's despite a record amount of U.S. tax money being devoted to recovery. A full measure investigation crunched the numbers. An estimated $48 billion for Puerto Rico will come from emergency recovery funds. $43 billion more has been appropriated by Congress so far. In all, it's estimated the recovery effort in Puerto Rico will amount to 91 billion U.S. tax dollars. Of that amount, we found the island has only received about 14 billion. The biggest single chunk, $5 billion, was spent fixing the electric system, which was already failing before the hurricane. Nearly $20 billion has been earmarked for housing and shelter under community planning and development, but 2 years after Maria, less than $1 million has been paid out. Omar Murrow is one of Puerto Rico's top hurricane recovery officials.
When you talk about how much money has been allocated, earmarked, or obligated for Puerto Rico, you're talking about billions. And then you're like, well, they're well off. No, that money, even though it has been obligated, there's not still available for the people. This is the drama classroom.
Murrow told us not one damaged Puerto Rican school has seen permanent repairs in the past 2 years.
This is the music. Look at this.
Oh, what is that?
That's, we call it comehen. This is it's termites. I don't know how they say in English, comehen. But
Like their tunnel?
Yes.
Is this classroom being used?
Yes. And those ceilings, they were affected by a hurricane.
And obviously it rains in here.
It rains and it will.
It rains.
Exactly. painting over the mold, but the mold has not been remediated. The mold is from the hurricane.
Man, we'll go ahead and put your water wings on here. Front or back push.
To find out what's wrong,
Secure left front, right front, and rear. Right.
we began with a helicopter tour of the 110-mile-long island, spotting dots of blue that mark homes that still have no roofs. Puerto Rico is extremely poor. At least 46% of its residents, 1.3 million people, were on welfare before the hurricanes.
And what do we see up here?
Alberto Martinez, a history professor and Puerto Rico native, has been tracking the slow progress on the ground.
Here we see one of the blue tarps distributed by FEMA to cover rooftops. These tarps were supposed to be usable only for 30 days, and yet it's 2 years after Hurricane Maria, and yet still here it is.
Have the blue tarps kind of become a symbol of what's been left undone 2 years later?
It's a symbol of the neglect. There's a bureaucracy in the way that prevents actual funds from being dispersed to individuals. Certainly contractors are making money, but individuals are not getting relief.
There are still a lot of homes with tarps, yes.
We took our questions to the top man in Puerto Rico from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Jonathan Hoyes.
2 years later, they're spending their own money, local money, to paint over mold because they don't have FEMA money or federal money to fix the roofs and to do anything else.
We're not happy with the fact that people, as you say, if they are painting over mold, are doing that.
But it turns out the biggest disaster relief effort in American history is also the most complicated. Part of the explanation can be found in massive protests against Puerto Rico's government while we were there in July.
Fueling discontent in Puerto Rico is news that a number of government officials and contractors are under FBI investigation over allegations involving misuse of all the taxpayer money sent in after Hurricane Maria.
The FBI has arrested 6 top Puerto Rican government officials and consultants. Also charged, FEMA official Asha Tribble. Once an Obama Homeland Security advisor, Tribble took the lead on getting Puerto Rico's electric grid fixed. Now she's accused of taking bribes to steer a $1.8 billion contract to a company called Cobra. Cobra's CEO at the time, and a FEMA friend of Tribble's who went to work for Cobra, were also arrested. All have denied wrongdoing.
The FBI has arrested some top officials here and said that it's looking into hurricane recovery fraud. How would it be possible to steal or commit corruption with this money that's being carefully tracked?
It would happen in the procurement process because obviously for any permanent work that would be initiated with disaster funding, you have to do procurement. So unfortunately, most of this recovery processes and as many other jurisdictions, we will not be exempt from wrongdoing.
What's more, communities normally fund their own immediate repairs and apply to get paid back by FEMA. But Puerto Rico was bankrupt and mired in a corruption scandal before the hurricanes. That means they didn't have cash on hand.
FEMA, it is totally agnostic to the fiscal and economic situation of Puerto Rico. So, as opposed to Texas, we don't have a rainy day fund.
Because you're already under financial management because of
Exactly.
your sort of like a bankruptcy.
Exactly, because when we came into public office, we were already dealing with 2 man-made hurricanes, fiscal and economic crisis. Those challenges on the fiscal side exacerbates even more the recovery process in Puerto Rico.
The program may expect a community to lay out initial money and get paid back for it later.
That's right.
But Puerto Rico really doesn't have that spare money.
Some of the assumptions we have about what a community can do for itself and how quickly they can do it don't necessarily apply, and that's where we all have to be as flexible and as patient, but as resourceful as we can be.
Both Puerto Rico and FEMA insist they're doing what they can to get money to the needy while making sure it's not lost to waste or fraud. Even without most of the recovery money actually in hand, Puerto Rico is slowly returning to normal.
We try to help each other recover, but it was hard. It was really hard.
For months, Mago Garcia says she cared for her mother and sister, both disabled, without power or running water.
I don't work in 7 or 8 months.
You had to close down this business?
I don't have money, no tourists, no.
Now she's been able to reopen the roadside business she's operated for the past 27 years. And hurricane recovery officials tell us victims like Brenda Rodriguez may yet qualify for some aid, such as cash for relocating to a more livable house. For now, there's just no telling when that might be.
Puerto Rico's governor resigned over the summer. The new governor has announced plans to review hurricane relief funds and all government contracts. Ahead on Full Measure, as tens of thousands of people illegally cross our southern border, we take you to a volunteer center helping families stuck in limbo. By all accounts, our system to handle illegal immigrants and asylum seekers has become overwhelmed. In the fiscal year that just ended, more than 760,000 illegal immigrants were picked up crossing our border from Mexico into the southeastern United States. Federal authorities released some of the families to volunteer centers, like one we recently visited in Tucson, Arizona.
It's dinner time at this way station for new arrivals.
How many people have you fed, like, at the max, do you know, here?
I think the most people we've had in the building was 450 people. So we had people eating in here and in this hallway and outside.
Diego Javier Peña Lopez heads up the program at Casa Alitas, which translates to House Wings. It's staffed by volunteers and funded by Catholic Community Services.
So typically they present themselves are with immigration for up to 72 hours, and then they are released to our care to help them connect to their sponsors.
These are people who are determined to be not a risk.
Yes.
The mission began in 2014 when Casa Alitas set up at Tucson bus stations after federal officials dropped immigrants off in growing numbers with no help. The operation expanded, and a year ago, organizers got word that large groups were being released across Arizona. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands.
What did you think when you heard they were going to be releasing from custody so many people at one time?
Wow. I mean, the first was of shock.
In February, Casa Alitas moved into this large monastery in Tucson, Arizona, and quickly filled it up.
How many people have you helped and processed since early February?
We've helped in this facility about 12,500 people.
That's huge.
It's a little bit, yeah, it's crazy. The alternative, if we weren't existing, is these families would be dropped off at the bus stations with no knowledge of our busing system, no money, no resources, and oftentimes lost because this was not near their initial entry point in the United States. So everyone goes through a medical screening. So we have a screening sheet to make sure everyone's safe, has the medical needs, all their medical needs are met. We give them shoelaces, hair ties, lotion, things that are often misplaced or lost while they're in ICE custody.
The refugees get help buying bus tickets to get to their U.S. destinations.
All the families have sponsors within the United States, so it's either family members and friends that they have a place to go to.
They're here for maybe 2-3 days?
1 to 3 days. So here's an example of one of the rooms, group housing. So this is mothers and daughters and sons under the age of 12. And food, diapers, and formula. And then in this room over here is our art room. So the only prompt that we give the families in this space is to draw something that makes you happy. So we've had people make houses, do clay art, as well as our Spanish classes are done in here. This is where we perform our intake. Today we had a child who was wheelchair bound, and his mother, and the wheelchair broke. So here we are with some of our medical professionals trying to figure out how to get him a wheelchair.
That child and mother are 35-year-old Andrea Castro and her 11-year-old son, Jeremias. Castro tells me they literally jumped the fence into the U.S. at 3 in the morning the day we visited.
You must be tired.
Sí.
Where are you planning to go?
Nueva York.
She says they made the trip from Guatemala. She didn't have the money to pay human smugglers, but had a permit to be in Mexico and enough cash for bus tickets. These snapshots are from their trip.
How many people were in your group?
Just 2 young males. I traveled alongside them.
A translator helped us.
I'm interested in the process. First, how did she cross the border? Where did they take her first? And how did she end up here?
So I crossed. I was walking until immigration got me, and now I'm here.
Did you want to be picked up by immigration.
Yes, I wanted to turn myself in.
Tell me how you came from Guatemala. How long ago did you leave, and how did you get through Mexico to the United States border?
It took me about 15 days. God has been good to me, and he has always placed good people in front of me.
She crossed with two men, strangers, she says, who helped her and Jeremias get over the fence. It was mutually beneficial, she says, because they crossed with a child. They wouldn't be detained in the U.S.
Because of the child, she can help get somebody else in?
Yes, they helped me to cross the fence. That's what I remember. I left at 3 in the morning. I was very sleepy, and we crossed there. They helped me with the wheelchair, even when it was broken, because it was already broken.
Why climb instead of walk through and let them pick you up?
Well, I jumped from the other side to be on the American side, and I walked through a street so the wheelchair could go, and that's when immigration caught me. If immigration caught me on the other side, they would have sent me back to my country.
How do you feel about being in the United States? Basically, after all of your 15 days of travels and climbing the fence and the broken wheelchair, you're here in the United States.
I feel that I came to find a family. I feel good here. Immigration treated me very good here in the United States. Here I feel the love, and I thank everybody. Everyone who lends their services here.
We checked in with Andrea Castro, and she made it to her family in New York, where her son is getting treatment. Coming up on Full Measure, who's really writing our laws? A surprising study next. A disturbing study shows that no matter where you live, a lot of the state laws you live by aren't written by the people you elect or even their staff. Gordon Whitkin, executive editor at the Center for Public Integrity, tells us about evidence his group found in a joint investigation with USA Today and the Arizona Republic.
We each used different forms of a computerized tool to look for matching language in state legislation. And we found a heck of a lot of it, frankly. Thousands of bills that were virtually word to word with other bills being proposed in other states.
What does that tell you in just a sentence before we dig in, that there were so many bills that matched up?
Well, it tells you that many bills, really a frightening number of bills in state legislatures, are being written by special interests of one kind or another and handed out to friendly lawmakers and then introduced in state after state after state with very little knowledge or understanding that this is being done. It's very difficult for journalists, or has been, for them to connect these dots.
The average American, I think, probably assumes that their laws are written by their elected officials. But your report states quite often that's not the case. The quote is, corporations, interest groups, or their lobbyists often write fill-in-the-blank documents, then shop them to state lawmakers. Can I assume that many of our laws, therefore, aren't written to benefit we the people? They're more written to the benefit of these interests?
That's correct.
Does this explain why sometimes we hear an issue brought up maybe in one state, and before we know it, every state's considering kind of the same thing? In the past, I think, and currently it's been marijuana legalization laws, all seem to be happening at the same time. There are also abortion on both sides laws that are being introduced, but maybe this is not so organic.
No, often it's not. Often it springs from the kind of phenomenon we're talking about, whereby special interests, either on the left or the right, are pushing these bills in a whole variety of states at once. We are finishing up work, for instance, on abortion bills, and we found that both sides, the abortion rights community and those who want to limit abortion, are making really deft use of model legislation in pushing bills around the country.
Which states did you find had the most bills that were copied from special interests that proposed them?
Pennsylvania was one of the leaders. There have also been a lot of these bills in Texas. One phenomena is that legislatures that don't meet for very long, or in some cases meet only once every 2 years, really have a crushing workload and thus are relying more on lobbyists to do large hunks of their work.
Are there other things that these special interests do to convince or make it a sweet deal for lawmakers to accept their legislation?
We have found a number of special interest groups will have large meetings for lawmakers, or perhaps junket is a better word, where they'll fly lawmakers into, we found one in one case, to Disney World, pay for their expenses, wine them and dine them, and mix that in with a lot of ideology and pushing the causes that special interest is in favor of. And then when the meeting's over, they'll hand lawmakers a piece of model legislation and say, well, we hope you've had a wonderful time. When you go back, could you introduce this piece of legislation for us?
But this is legal.
Yes.
In conclusion, why would you say this matters to the average person?
Well, I think it goes back to something you said, which is that citizens have a right to believe that their legislators are working for them in the public interest. But what we found here is a system in which legislators are often working on behalf of special interests, and that not only is that alarming, but that most even members of the public have no idea how this system is working.
In terms of quantity, Whitkins says the evidence shows tens of thousands of state bills in the past decade were copycat bills. Back with a look at what's ahead next week after this. Next week on Full Measure, our investigation into a fatally flawed VA system that has resulted in tragic consequences.
Well, he was at the VA hospital crying to them. He even told me, I cried to him, Dad, I gotta be an inpatient, you gotta put me in. And they told him, come back in a month.
The Army vet who exposed the troubling issues next week on Full Measure. While we were in Northern Ireland recently shooting stories for the season, we came across what just might be the last casualty of the Titanic, the famed and fated ship that sank in 1912 on its maiden voyage. It was built in Belfast at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Its giant yellow cranes can be seen from miles away, but Harland and Wolff has fallen on hard times, and there's no work there right now. The last few hundred employees are temporarily on layoff. There is a ray of hope we found. There could be a new contract to partially build British naval frigates there and keep the shipyard from sinking into history like the Titanic. That's all for this week. Until next time, thanks for watching. We'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.